Here's to the crazy ones. The misfits. The rebels. The troublemakers, the round pegs in square holes, the ones who see things differently. They're not fond of rules, and they have no respect for the status quo. You can quote them, disagree with them, glorify or vilify them. About the only thing you can't do is ignore them. Because they change things. They push the human race forward. And while some may see them as the crazy ones, we see genius. Tumblr. Because the people who are crazy enough to think they can change the world are the ones who do. Tumblr may be a hell site full of nauseating discourse, but at least they haven't integrated a stories feature like literally every other social media site. That takes too much knowledge of coding. This site's error messages say whoopsie.
Fandom Tumblr used to like itself. In fact, Fandom Tumblr used to fancy itself better, more progressive, more unified, more welcoming than anywhere else on the internet. And maybe in some ways they weren't totally wrong. Still, whatever kind of utopia Tumblr was in the early 2010s, it's a dying platform now. People more or less assume it was the NSFW ban of 2018 that finally sank it, but I think the ball was rolling long before that. Because the Tumblr users I first knew weren't there for NSFW content unless your definition of NSFW is pretty liberal. They were there for fandom and fandom first. I was there for fandom. I liked drawing anime when I was younger, so naturally I was a DeviantArt kid, and I do mean kid. I got into Homestuck through DeviantArt and then migrated to Tumblr when I realized that most of the Homestuck action was there. And it wasn't like anything I'd ever experienced before. Tumblr and DeviantArt are both creative fan spaces, but on DeviantArt, at least in my corner of it, your fanhood was sort of defined by your ability to make art for your fandom. Art that honored it. Art that was, as LiveJournal and Dreamwidth user Obsession Inc. put it, affirmational, not transformational. On Tumblr, being a fan of something meant talking about it. And Tumblr talked so much about the things it was a fan of, enough that its fanish dialogue birthed its own completely fabricated text, as Paul Booth puts it in his book, Crossing Fandoms, SuperWhoLock and the contemporary fan audience. SuperWhoLock came into this world a sort of marriage of three fandoms: Doctor Who, Sherlock, and Supernatural. And it wasn't a niche thing. It was, I think, the most powerful entity on Tumblr at the time. But why these disparate texts? Well, Booth argues that they are in fact artificially disparate. Essentially, SuperWhoLock isn't just the sum of its crossover texts. It isn't just shorthand for super and who and lock. It's SuperWhoLock. It's its own thing. Each subcanon fills in the blanks of the other's gaps. But if you're wondering why those three shows specifically were subject to this treatment, there are a variety of possible reasons. Martina Dvorakova, an early member of the SuperWhoLock fandom and gif-fake auteur, who shared some of her insights with Booth, cites their similar dynamic. All three shows involve characters solving crimes, mysteries, and other large-scale problems. So according to her, it's easy for the fans to think of a plot that could include characters from all these shows. Booth also mentions each of the three shows' distinct iconography, their Monster of the Week style episodes, and their troubled and emotional white male protagonists. I want to add that each of these shows, despite any protests from their showrunners, has a fairly obvious potential queer reading. Supernatural has Destiel, Sherlock has Johnlock, and Doctor Who, in addition to being pretty campy and having a massive decades-old canon that opens itself to just about any kind of reading you could want for, is about a being whose physical form changes each time they regenerate, even if their soul remains the same, making the soul explicitly ungendered, though the first woman doctor didn't come until after SuperWhoLock's heyday. I surveyed 54 current and former SuperWhoLock fans about when they got into SuperWhoLock, how old they were, why they got into SuperWhoLock, and if they aren't into it anymore, why not? I had a multiple choice question asking what drew them to the fandom, and 30 people, more than half of all the respondents, and the highest amount of responses on this question, said Destiel or Johnlock. SuperWhoLock is inherently transformational. Queer fandom, and queer art in general, has often been transformational, and often by necessity. The LGBTQ+ community was written out of history. It's needed to find its place in history's gaps. For instance, a lot of films from the new queer cinema movement grapple with this historical void and end up making what I like to call a new queer history, a new historical canon formed in the cracks of the assigned one. One such new queer history film is Velvet Goldmine, the 1998 Todd Haynes movie, which a lot of people know as almost a David Bowie biopic, but it's not really. It's not about its star Brian Slade's life so much as it is about his illusory and ever-shifting star identity, and the way the world reacts to him, a man who knew nothing of himself but that he had to create a sensation. Brian Slade staged the faux shooting of his character Maxwell Demon, a Ziggy Stardust pastiche, towards the end of the 70s glam rock era and disappeared from the public eye shortly after. And now, in what Haynes draws as a very cold corporate 80s that contrasts the vibrance of the decade prior, journalist Arthur Stewart is trying to piece together the mystery of Brian's whereabouts. It's been referred to a lot as a sort of queer Citizen Kane, except Thompson from Citizen Kane is a fascinated outsider. Arthur was a part of the glam rock scene in the 70s, and participating in Brian Slade's fandom gave him a space to negotiate his identity. We see Arthur as a closeted queer teenager in his parents' house. We see his consumption of Brian content spark really sweet, sincere attempts to explore his presentation. We see Arthur explore his own sexuality through the homoerotic displays of Brian and fellow glam rock star Kurt Wilde, and we see him punished harshly for doing so. Then he leaves his home, moves to the city, starts to become a real member of the scene, the community, and he moves in with the band and he seems really happy. And during all this, Brian's constructed life is unraveling and the glam rock scene is starting to die. There's this moment that really gets me every time at the Death of Glitter concert, which is like a farewell to the era, where Arthur is dancing too enthusiastically, bumping into people, taking up too much space. And another concert goer pulls him aside and scolds him, tells him to dial it back. It really viscerally hurts me to watch because we've seen Arthur get scolded for his mode of expression before, and now here, he was supposed to be free from the policing of his expression now. Why are the fans policing each other? So there's Arthur in the 70s, full of trepidation and life. Then there's Arthur in the 80s, whose outlook and style have become as bleak as his surroundings. We aren't shown any kind of transition between the two. So it's more like the death of an identity rather than the evolution of one. As Chad Bennett notes in Flaming the Fans, Shame and the Aesthetics of Queer Fandom in Todd Haynes' Velvet Goldmine, the film mourns the loss of the rich excess of affect surrounding Arthur's adolescence in the glam era. The teenage Arthur scampers through the adult Arthur's memory in the movie, wearing a perpetual heartbreaking blush, and the film parallels Slade's ascent to stardom with Arthur's memories of all the things of his lost youth at odds with normative culture, especially his now repressed fandom and queer sexuality. Presumably, it's shame, at least partially shame from other fans for Arthur's failure to perform fanhood properly that forces Arthur back into repression. But shame was also the inciting force for Arthur fleeing home. Bennett examines the scene wherein Arthur boards the bus to leave his parents behind, and asserts that Arthur does not board the bus for London and leave his shame behind, but rather leaves his parents' home in shame, taking the shame he brought to that home with him as a passport to the queer pleasures of glam London, an ephemeral metropolis the film's narrator describes, quoting Wilde, as a land where all things are perfect and poisonous. And shame, queer shame, is the foundation of every character in Velvet Goldmine. So what do we make of it that shame is what galvanizes queer art and queer fan practice, and also what kills it? Towards the beginning of the film, we can see that even if it's a subculture and not the dominant culture, glam rock is cool, and we can see that in the 80s it just isn't part of the zeitgeist anymore. Bennett addresses the film's view that the erotics of queer fandom are inseparable from the marketplace economy, and that the same shame that enables affective ties and dismantles moral hierarchies can, if disavowed, become the instrument of those very same or new moral hierarchies. In 2012, SuperWhoLock fan practice was a really exciting new thing, and you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who really had a problem with it. And SuperWhoLock was inextricable from Tumblr itself, and in 2012, Tumblr was on the upswing. Tumblr liked itself. Tumblr talked a lot about how much it liked itself. Its users fantasized about a Tumblr prom, a Tumblr university, a Tumblr country, a Tumblr convention. And in 2014, a Tumblr convention was held. Dashcon. It was an abject failure. Sarah Zed talks a lot about it in her video, Tumblr's Failed Convention, The Story of Dashcon. In it, she examines Dashcon's careless and incompetent leadership. They failed to pay the convention center everything they owed, and the con almost got shut down while it was happening, and not wanting to admit to their own mistakes, the organizers tried to convince their mostly teenage attendees that it was because the owners of the venue didn't like them. They raised enough money on Kickstarter not to get kicked out entirely, but they lost several of their high-profile guests due to their failure to compensate them like they'd agreed to. It was a letdown and an embarrassment for everyone in attendance, and it was a letdown and an embarrassment for everyone who'd previously been excited about the idea of a Tumblr convention. And it seems like it was after Dashcon that Tumblr stopped being a self-congratulatory place and started being a self-deprecating one. Sarah Zed notices this too.
On that note though, one interesting consequence post-Dashcon is that the atmosphere of Tumblr itself very rapidly changed. After the con happened, I saw fewer and fewer people referring to Tumblr as a friendly, home-like community for them, and more people referring to it as a hell site. I also never again unironically saw a post wishing there was a Tumblr university or a Tumblr island. I think this shift from Tumblr's users loving it to hating it wasn't only because of Dashcon. There were a number of other social factors at play that I could spend a whole video talking about. But Dashcon definitely left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, and a lot of folks came out of the event embarrassed to be members of the Tumblr community.
And Tumblr users now seem very keen to define our current era as post-Dashcon. I found a lot of the old Tumblr posts I'm featuring here on the blog Heritage Posts, and Heritage Posts will often refer to positive Tumblr on Tumblr type posts from the early 2010s as pre-Dashcon relics. But you know how Sarah Zed mentioned social factors? I really think that if there hadn't been other cracks forming in Tumblr's self-perception, the response to Dashcon would have been one more characterized by anger at the organizers than embarrassment of Tumblr. And Dashcon wasn't the only landmark event in online fandom history that happened in 2014. I'm not a gamer. I knew Gamergate was happening in the mid-2010s. I knew a bunch of guys were mad at Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian over video games, and that it seemed blown out of proportion, and that was pretty much it. And after reading about it, I feel like I still don't really understand. Kyle Wagner, who wrote an article called "The Future of the Culture Wars is Here, and It's Gamergate," suggests I'm not really supposed to. Per Wagner,
by design, Gamergate is nearly impossible to define. It refers variously to a set of incomprehensible Benghazi-type conspiracy theories about game developers and journalists, to a fairly broad group of gamers concerned with corruption in gaming journalism, to a somewhat narrower group of gamers who believe women should be punished for having sex, and finally to a small group of gamers conducting organized campaigns of stalking and harassment against women. This ambiguity is useful because it turns any discussion of this subject into a debate over semantics. Really, though, Gamergate is exactly what it appears to be, a relatively small and very loud group of video game enthusiasts who claim that their goal is to audit ethics in the gaming industrial complex, and who are instead defined by the campaigns of criminal harassment that some of them have carried out against several women. Whether the broader Gamergate movement is a willing or inadvertent semi-respectable front here is an interesting but ultimately irrelevant question.
Suzanne Scott in Fake Geek Girls, Fandom, Gender, and the Convergence Culture Industry concedes that Wagner was right. Gamergate has come to be defined by its most vicious and sexist participants. What I think Scott, Wagner, Vox, The Washington Post, all the scholarship and journalism I've read surrounding Gamergate get at points, is that Gamergate as a whole isn't about Anita Sarkeesian or Zoe Quinn or anyone specifically, really. It's about what gets to be called a game. Who gets to be called a gamer? Whose fanish discourse has validity and whose does not? And Scott writes in the next chapter of Fake Geek Girls about the war on fangirls, in which women are routinely derided for critiquing hegemonic media representations or calling for more diversity within the culture industries, or dismissed as fake geek girls, thereby foreclosing their access to the identity of fan and attempting to silence them, has accompanied the mainstreaming of geek and fan culture. So naturally, Tumblr, the hub of queer and feminine-coded transformational fandom, the websites where fangirls created entirely fabricated texts out of shows made by and starring men wherein their OTPs were canon, the website with a lot of young people, especially young women, exploring both fandom and sexuality in a way that was inaccessible to straight cis men, was the target of a lot of vitriol. And it looks to me like Gamergate was mostly about the marketplace. It seems like a substantial sect of them were interested in getting feminist games pulled, in using their boycotting power to keep game producers from, putting female characters in practical clothing, I don't know. And the market, in a lot of ways, had sided with Gamergate, sided with hegemonic masculinity, and with the entitlement, the chauvinism, the anti-intellectualism that Gamergate amplified and encouraged, the way it was both a symbol of the masculine hegemony getting pissed at feminine-coded fandom and intellectualism, and a signal for anyone with a vested interest in upholding the masculine hegemony to get pissed at feminine-coded fandom and intellectualism, there's discourse that suggests it could have had such massive cultural effects as giving rise to the conditions that facilitated Trump's presidential victory. So it's not a stretch to think that even if Tumblr remained a sort of bastion for left-wing-ish politics and negotiation of queer identity, its users might have also internalized a lot of the relatively mainstream violent discourse surrounding themselves. And in my SuperWhoLock survey, I asked anyone who was no longer in the fandom to share with me when they left and why. A lot of people had specific critiques of the shows or were sick of getting queer-baited, but a lot of people noted that there just wasn't much of a fandom to speak of anymore, or that it was dying down. And the responses that gave me a year largely said that seemed to happen in 2014 and 2015. So where are we now in 2020? I want to talk about our current cultural moment more broadly, but it's really hard to process the time you're living through. So something I do find interesting is that the Ben Shapiros and Milo Yiannopoulos and the Tommy Laurens of the world don't actually have as much sway over public discourse as they used to, at least not outside of their own circles. Or maybe I just think that because I'm not in high school anymore like I was in the mid-2010s, but left-wing YouTuber ContraPoints, at one point in her video Cringe, talks about how fellow left-wing YouTuber H-Bomber guy sort of took this right-wing 4chan lolcow concept of cringe and managed to weaponize it against those same groups. And I think public intellectuals, YouTube video essayists like H-Bomber guy and ContraPoints herself, and even more media culture-centric creators like Lindsay Ellis or Sarah Zed, who was kind enough to let me use her footage in this video, have replaced the conservative provocateurs that used to dominate the platform. So what that reclamation of cringe as a successful rhetorical device tells us is that people will flock to whoever looks the best, whoever comes out of the argument sounding smarter, whoever's cooler. What that tells us is that if you want to win a culture war, image is important. And I think the current image that American youth wants to project has once again become one with substantial queer influence. It's reflected in the art and media we're preferring. Euphoria is a really popular show among Gen Z audiences right now, and its most important relationship is a lesbian romance featuring a trans girl. 100 Gex, a musical duo that according to researcher Miles Luce renders genre and gender absurd, is mainstream now with a huge listener base. They're also on Trinity College Dublin's University Philosophical Society's guest list for the year, alongside Judith Butler. Even Harry Styles, whose public image was more or less typical boy band guy in the early 2010s, is now more of an almost fluid presenting rock star who stirred up outrage among vocal conservatives because he wore a dress in Vogue. So in this pretty queer post-Dashcon, post-Gamergate, almost post-Trump moment, let's check in on how Tumblr feels about Tumblr.
I don't really want to leave Tumblr. I've been here since 2011. No other platform has the right format for me to just randomly barf actual thoughts, jokes, and genuine creative content all in the same breath. I don't know how to compartmentalize. Every other platform, you gotta be a real person. Here, you are your icon and username and whatever your hyperfixation is at the current moment. On Tumblr, you can make a post that just says Minecraft and get 50k notes, where on Twitter you have to steal tweets and Instagram you have to be hot. Tumblr is more like a bunch of kids let loose in Walmart where there are no rules and the only god is a bald Swedish man.
I think both current and former Tumblr users have started to look at their early days on the website with a sort of loving nostalgia instead of cringe. If they hadn't, then the recent Supernatural finale and half-hearted canonizing of Destiel wouldn't have received the massive and massively amused response that it did. I look back at early Tumblr with a sort of loving nostalgia now. That wasn't always the case. In 2015 and 2016, I was embarrassed to even still be on Tumblr. I winced when I remembered the intensity of my fandom participation just a couple years prior. But I went to Comic-Con when I was 12. I cosplayed Jane from Homestuck, and when you're cosplaying in a building full of people who are also cosplaying and you don't know whether to be in character or out of character, so you're trying to strike a happy medium, and you're 12, so your dad is chaperoning and he's so confused, that's a vulnerable moment. It's vulnerable to walk out into the world decked in signifiers of your fandom, to say, I like this thing so much that you'll see it when you look at me now. Of course I felt shame then. I also felt really connected to everybody else there who was dressed for the same fandom as me. And I think that the moment in my life when the shame of my fan activity became too high a price to pay for the bliss that preceded it was when the community started to disappear. But it was fun to be on Tumblr that night that Castiel confessed to Dean, which was about a month ago now. I'm not alone in thinking it felt like the early days, because it wasn't that people were excited about barely canon Destiel, it was that everyone on my radar was talking about it. Everyone had so much to say about the same thing, and a lot of it was intensely critical, and the majority of it was goofy and fun, and as the kids say, unhinged. When I participate in fandom in a way that I can't help but feeling is too much, I feel shame that crystallizes into pleasure and unity.